Welcome back to the Reason for Truth podcast. I'm your host, Stephen Garofalo. Appreciate you. I know what happened. You went and hit that subscribe button. I hope you did. And then you hit that little alert bell. And that little alert bell says, hey, Garofalo's come back up. Reason for Truth is back up for part 2 of Commonalities of the Rich and Poor. Listen, welcome back to part 2. And I appreciate you tuning in to hear more about what God's Word has to say about the commonalities that the rich and poor have in common. Now, the Bible says the rich and the poor have a common bond. Remember? We talked about that last week. And that is that the Lord is the maker of them all. Proverbs 22:2. Most people believe that the rich have it all, again, that the poor have nothing. And as we said last week, I guess it depends on what you mean by have it all, right? You can have all the money in the world and be pretty miserable. There's a lot of people like that, by the way. Welcome to Reason for Truth, where the truth comes first and the reasons come last, but we're always and constantly learning, because when we stop learning, we stop teaching, or at least stop teaching well. Today's truth is that the rich and the poor have the same amount of hours in a day, the same number of days of the year, and listen, only one lifetime to live. Today's truth is that the rich and the poor both face trials. The poor believer is to glorify or to count it all joy in the fact that God has exalted him or her by allowing them to experience the difficult circumstances, right, of not having the wealth of others. By the same token, the rich believer is also to glorify God when a trial brings him low, because it teaches him or her that, listen, this life is short. You can't take all you have with you. Can't take that wealth with you, so better do well with it. They face the same fate, both do, the rich and the poor. They're always going down into the earth. They're going to be buried, put in a box. They're going to put into the ground. Now, today I'm going to go to show you that the rich and the poor both have struggles, both have temptations, and each one must do the same exact thing, which is to stay focused on God. God has provided for each person, and he's also prepared and kind of warned people in his word not to be lured into temptation of trusting in your wealth or the lack thereof. Don't let your identity be that you're a poor person or a rich person. Let it be a believer in Jesus Christ. That's where all believers' identities really should be. Listen, what I mean, we talked about lot in life. I'm not saying that people can't rise to economically or professional status. Certainly they can, and we should be shooting towards excellence. That's something that the body sometimes fails at. But our attitude should be one of gratitude regarding the lot that the Lord has given us and moving forward, right? Wherever that may be. So you may be, listen, you could be third generation in a company and you could be the president, right? You've been given quite a bit. Other people, they're starting off in the mailroom and they end up as a president one day. How great of a success that is. I think that's awesome. But listen, coveting what we don't have, that's not good. Let's jump right now into an article posted December 27th, 2019 called 5 Myths About the Lotto. I like this, by the Washington Post. According to the National Endowment for Financial Education, 70% of people who win a lottery or receive a large windfall go bankrupt within a few years. And I've heard this before. Listen, what do the 70% of these people that go bankrupt share in common? Really? What do you think? All of these people, the 70%, that's basically 7 out of 10 who win the lotto go bankrupt. What do they share in common? First, they were all once poor, probably, or maybe middle class. Second, they all suddenly became very rich. Third, 70% of them ended up bankrupt. They lost all they had. Ended up really worse than when they first started, because they got rich. It probably destroyed friendships, their credit, and everything else. And listen, they decided to change or ignore their identity in Christ, and they chose to change or ignore the lot in life that God gave them, simply because, why? You can. When you don't have to work, you've heard that, oh, well, if I run the lotto, I wouldn't change anything, right? So you're going to go back to work, right, if you don't like what you do. It doesn't mean you have to stay there, but go do something productive, because you saw what happened, right, when you had King David and had King Solomon. When you're not doing your job, you get yourself into trouble. You see, both the rich and the poor share the same evil temptations. They may be tempted in some of the very same ways and maybe some different ways. Talked about that, right, last week. The poor is not going to typically be tempted on a yacht, but they certainly could be tempted with drugs. And drugs affect the rich and the poor. But nonetheless, the temptation is really a sin problem, and it involves spiritual warfare, which does not discriminate on income level or wealth level or poverty level. The rich are tempted to trust in their riches for their identity, security, and power. Sometimes, listen, that happens in the poor neighborhoods too. When President Bush put in the school choice vouchers, basically, if I remember reading an article, it said 80% didn't want to go to the better schools because they didn't want to lose their identity. to better themselves. So there you go. It happens on both sides of the stream, right? Furthermore, the rich are often tempted to sin due to the high level of financial freedom their wealth affords them. This is, in turn, leads to excess of living, gluttony, greed, and false belief that they are no longer really need to depend on God. And the same could be true of welfare recipients, right? If you don't have any responsibilities, you don't have any financial things hanging on you. Listen, you're just as free, you just don't have anything like yachts and stuff like that, but you have the same sense of freedom because someone else is paying for your food in your house, right? And so there's no longer a need to depend on God, who allowed for the provision for the wealthy to begin with, or even for those who don't have a lot of wealth who are depending on the government or otherwise. And listen, as a result, they end up really worshiping the riches or the freedom that they have instead of God, who provided that for them. Now, James reminds us in James 1:16-17 that riches are good things. And listen, it says this: "Do not be deceived, my beloved brothers. Every good gift and every perfect gift is from above, coming down from the Father of lights, with whom there is no variation or shadow due to change." God doesn't change. His light is always perfectly the same. He doesn't change. He doesn't sin, doesn't make mistakes. Now, this leads us to look at the issue of both the rich and the poor blaming God for their problems. That happens as well. A lot of people falsely believe that being wealthy eliminates all your problems in the world, all your stress in the world. Nah, man, let me tell you, nothing can be further from the truth. My pastor back in Washington, D.C. said, be happy if you just make a meager salary. He says, the more money, the more headaches. He says, I know, these people are in my office every week. We're going back to the Bible, but listen, as such, the rich and the poor alike are not to blame God for temptations, which come to both equally, right? With this in mind, it's important to note that both the rich and the poor need to be careful as to not blame God for what they have materially or maybe what they don't have materially. James tells us in verse 13, "Let no one say when he is tempted, I'm being tempted by God. For God cannot be tempted with evil, and he himself tempts no one. But each person is tempted when he is lured and enticed by his own desire. Then desire, when it is conceived, gives birth to sin, and sin, when it is fully grown, brings forth death." James 1:13. The interesting thing about temptation is that temptation affects both the rich and the poor, folks. It affects them equally. I bet that there are many people who disagree with this point. They say, I'm poor, but I'm telling you it's worse for me. No, it's not. We're all human. But I'm going to challenge such thinking that temptation is simply being lured into sin. This affects both the rich and the poor equally. I'm telling you, I know, what some of you may be thinking. They might be saying, I'd rather be tempted as a rich person than as a poor person. All right, point made. Think about that for just a minute, though. A poor person has nothing to lose financially, but the rich person does have something more to lose. Listen, both risk if they do something wrong. When they do drugs, they have an extramarital affair, they both risk losing their family. But the difference is the one who has a lot of money, he also can lose a lot of his wealth and his money, whether it's drug addiction, whether it's infidelity. The rich hold the risk of losing all the money and the way of life that they've gotten used to. The poor have a lot less, they just don't have that to lose, that component. So there you go. Verse 14 says, "But each person is tempted when he is lured," I like that word, L-U-R-E-D, "and enticed by his own desire." See, not God's temptation. It's James 1:14. The word lure is a fishing term, by the way, here in the Bible, whereby we get our word like lure, fishing lure. The idea is that the fish is safe and he's sound and is protected log. He's in a lake somewhere, in a pond or a creek. When the fisherman comes around, and he uses a very specific lure to tempt the fish. They know, I've been fishing for years. My brother's an expert fisher. Man, he just knows exactly what lure to put in. If it doesn't work, listen, within one or two, he nails it every time. He knows how to tempt those fish to come out into the open, out of their safety, the security of the underneath the water. And the fish is probably thinking, listen, that lure is tempting. It really looks like something good to eat. So listen, but it's really a decoy for the real deal. It's not really food. It's a lure, and it's a trap to entice the fish and using its own desire to have a meal of its choice. Now, notice that the fishing lures come in hundreds, if not thousands, of varieties. The rich and the poor find the very same lures in life. Both are tempted by sex, drugs, power, financial freedom, amongst many other things. Remember Michael Orr, he's a famous African-American football player who played left tackle for Carolina Panthers and 2 seasons with Baltimore Ravens and Tennessee Titans. He was adopted, remember, by the Toohey family. It was a book that we read. My buddy sent me the book. He said, read the book before you see the movie. And it was great. You definitely want to read the book before you see the movie. And it's about a white family in Tennessee, the Toohey family, and they adopted Michael Orr out of really the slums and the ghetto, or whatever you want to call it, into the projects. And he's poor. And the book is called The Blind Side. And anyways, they took him in, they tutored him, and really, to paraphrase the book, I remember Michael Orr said something in the book. You can read it, and I read it a long time ago, so I'm going to do my best here in the paraphrase. But he said it's kind of funny that to have this interesting or this funny kind of freedom that comes from living in the poor projects. There's a strange kind of freedom because really I don't have any responsibilities. You don't have any really, for the most part, major bills or utilities to pay. You pretty much do what you want when you want to do. It's kind of like poor freedom versus, and he didn't say those words, but rich freedom is the way I see it. And he says you do what you want with your time because you have no real place to be. And, no pressure to make the bills, no deadlines to meet or quotas. He said his words struck me interesting. He said it's just this funny kind of weird freedom. So in other words, no one really likes being poor, but you're still free. Someone else is taking care of your basic needs. Very interesting. And listen, he went on to become a football player and he got very well paid. Now, most people don't realize this, but the rich have quite a bit of pressure on them. And listen, they get to the point in some cases, to the point that they really have to work. They don't have to work any longer. They can hire other people to run their business, but they still have the pressure of making sure that their business is managed well. There's no such thing as putting it on cruise control. I know a lot of business owners. So in other cases, the rich have to work to maintain their own wealth, and all too often, their wealth defines them. Their true value, their identity becomes more important than God in their life. So let's remember the words of James in verse 16. He says, "Do not be deceived, my beloved brothers. Every good gift and every perfect gift is from above, coming down from the Father of lights, with whom there is no variation or shadow due to change." The point is that, folks, all good things come from God above. James as well speaks to the poor in that, listen, as they're lowly, they're poor, they ought to boast in their exaltation. To exalt God is to raise God to the highest place in your life, right? To give him first place in every thought and in your mind, every word spoken and every deed done. Both the wealthy and the rich are challenged on this equally. This cannot be done if we skip over our lot in life, the thing that God's got for us, in turn for either being wealthy and the vanity of that or desiring that. Listen, if we get caught up coveting what others have and we don't have, it's going to strangle us, strangle our joy, and it's going to take us off sight for our mission. Remember, today's truth is that both the rich and the poor face trials, many of the same trials. The poor believer is to the glory or count it all joy to the fact that God has exalted him by allowing him to experience difficult circumstances. For these will only perfect his character and faith, right? The rich believer can also glorify God and just be in that glory when a trial brings him low. And they do come just as frequently and just in a different form, because it teaches him or her that life is short and that his or her pursuits, that is their business, career, their wealth, all that stuff's going to fade away. The rich man should always trust in the Lord, not himself or his money. Both the rich and poor are equally susceptible to being lured into sin and sinful thinking of being superior due to their wealth and position of power, or sinful self-righteousness, sometimes on behalf of the poor for having less. I will say this, by being dependent on something other than God to provide for you is a bad thing. Wealthy are very susceptible. I think a little more susceptible than the poor of that, but the poor as well. If you're not moving ahead with the lot that's God given you in life, you're just depending on government or otherwise to take care of you, you fall in the same boat there in front of God. God doesn't look at things politically. He looks at things according to his moral values, to his moral word, right? Both the rich and the poor have equal amount of time and years to live. Keep that in mind. The question for both parties is not, listen, one of wealth or lack thereof, but one of fulfilling the lot of God that he has in your life. If you pursue God authentically, things like wealth, differing degrees, will follow. In the end, as Ecclesiastes says in 3:19, surely the fate of human beings is like that of the animals. The same fate awaits them both. As one dies, so dies the other. All have the same breath. Humans have no advantage over animals. Everything is meaningless. This includes, by the way, our worldly wealth, if it's not used rightly. Listen, in closing, let's remember that, number one, both the rich and the poor, and the most powerful and the least powerful, have 24 hours in a day. Second, every person, The most powerful, the rich, and the poor alike all have but one life to live with the same general amount of years. Now, the poor may live less, maybe a few years less, but they generally live 50, 60, 70, 80 years. And third, both the rich and the poor faces the same fate, meaning the same physical death, leaving their mortal body to go back to the clay and the grave, and their soul goes to the same place in the presence of the Lord, to face the Lord. Now, lastly, let's remember these words, the words of the Apostle James. It says, "Blessed is the man who remains steadfast under trial, for when he has stood the test, he will receive the crown of life, which God has promised to those who love him." Oh, the crown of life, huh? Salvation, being in front of God, and then the crowns for the good things we did with our wealth or our time and not squandered it to be slothful and do nothing but be poor, or by the same token, to work hard and use the great wealth God's given us, not to give a little bit, but to make sure that we're giving ourselves to where it hurts. Now, it's James 1:13. In closing, please leave your comments below, and I promise I'll respond to you a very reasonable amount of time. If you're listening on one of the podcast platforms, we're on just about all the big ones. Please consider a 5-star review, share it with others. If you're on iTunes, that would be appreciated. You can go to reasonfortruth.org or reasonfortruth.bible. Hit the YouTube dash podcast. Listen, if you're watching on YouTube especially, make sure you do 2 things. You always say this, man. Subscribe. Make sure you do a little Sicilian hook. Boom. Knock that little alert bell down there. Ding, ding. It may not make a noise like a bell, but you can just imagine it in your head. Ding, ding. I'll see you guys for the next Reason for Truth episode. I'm your host, Stephen Garofalo, and this is your Reason for Truth for today.